They said family comes first. But what happens when your stepfather humiliates you in front of everyone at Christmas and your mother says nothing? I didn't defend myself. I didn't demand an apology. I went home, opened a box my father left behind, and by sunrise, my stepfather's phone showed 57 missed calls he couldn't explain. I'm Emily Parker, and this is how one Christmas push turned into a reckoning no one saw coming. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, don't forget to hit subscribe, smash, like button, and tell us in the comments where you're tuning in from. Christmas Eve, 2023. The driveway was dusted with fresh snow, the kind that looks clean and forgiving until you step on it and feel how slick it really is. Warm, yellow light spilled from the windows of the house, glowing against the dark, like a promise that this year might be different. I arrived early, like I always did. I balanced a pie box in one hand and my coat over the other arm, unlocked the door with the spare key my mom had never taken back from me. The heat hit my face right away. Roasted turkey, cinnamon, that artificial pine scent from the candle she only lit in December. Christmas music played softly from a speaker on the counter, not loud enough to enjoy, just loud enough to fill the silence. I kicked off my boots and went straight into the kitchen. My mom, Lauren, stood at the counter basting the turkey with slow mechanical movements. She was dressed nicely, pearls at her neck hair carefully styled. She looked like someone getting ready for a performance she didn't want to give. "Hey," I said, setting the dessert down. "Need help?" She glanced at me, then back at the turkey. "You can set the table in a bit." I watched her for a second. Her shoulders were tight. She kept glancing at the clock above the stove, then toward the living room like she was waiting for something to go wrong. "You okay?" I asked. She didn't look at me this time. "Everything's fine," she said quickly. "Let's just get through tonight." That phrase landed heavier than it should have. Get through. Like Christmas was something to survive, not celebrate. Guests started arriving one by one. Coats piled up near the door. Voices filled the house. Laughter followed, but it felt thin, rehearsed like everyone was playing a part they already knew by heart. Whenever Richard entered a room, conversations shifted. People straightened. Jokes paused, then resumed in a different tone. He had that effect on people. My stepfather moved through the house like he owned it, which in every way that mattered to him he did. Richard Hale was loud without shouting, confident without ever smiling. He had a way of standing that made it feel like he was slightly above everyone else, even when he wasn't. I kept myself busy. Napkins, glasses, plates. If my hands were moving, my thoughts stayed quieter. Samantha arrived late as usual. The front door swung open, cold air rushing in, and suddenly the house felt different. She wore a long designer coat, the kind that probably cost more than my rent. Her heels clicked against the floor as she stepped inside. "There she is," Richard said loudly, crossing the room in 3 long strides. "My girl." He hugged her like she was something precious, something earned. Everyone smiled. Someone clapped lightly. Samantha laughed and let herself be admired, slipping out of her coat like this was exactly the entrance she'd planned. I stood near the kitchen doorway and watched. No one noticed me watching. Dinner was announced not long after. Chairs scraped against the floor as people moved toward the table. The dining room was crowded, warm, loud in that uncomfortable way big family dinners always are. I walked toward my usual seat near the kitchen. I'd sat there for years. It wasn't anyone's favorite spot, but it was mine. Close enough to help my mom, far enough to avoid being the center of attention. I pulled the chair back. Before I could sit, Richard stood up. The movement was sudden enough to make the room quiet. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't look angry. He looked calm, almost bored. "This seat is for my real daughter," he said. "Get out." The words hung in the air, heavy, deliberate. For a second, I honestly thought it was a joke. A bad one, but still a joke. I looked around the table, waiting for someone to laugh and say, "Come on, Richard." No one did. "Richard," I said quietly. "What?" He didn't answer. He stepped closer instead. Too close. I felt the space between us disappear. Then he pushed me. Not a shove fueled by rage. Not an accident. It was controlled. Calculated. Like he'd already decided how this would end. My foot slipped. I tried to grab the tablecloth, but my fingers missed. I went down hard, palms first. Then my hip slammed into the hardwood floor, the impact knocking the breath out of me. The pain came a second later. Sharp, radiating. For a brief moment, everything was silent. Then someone laughed. It wasn't everyone, but it was enough. I heard a snort from the far end of the table. A nervous laugh quickly covered by a cough. Silverware clinked. Someone muttered, "Oh my God." I lay there staring up at the ceiling, my heart pounding so loud I was sure everyone could hear it. I turned my head toward my mom. She was standing at the head of the table, hands clenched so tightly her knuckles had gone white. Her mouth was slightly open like she wanted to say something and couldn't find the words. She didn't move. She didn't say my name. No one did. No one reached out a hand. No one asked if I was okay. The table waited patient like this was just another interruption before dinner. I pushed myself up off the floor. My hands shook. My hips screamed in protest, but I stayed on my feet. I smoothed my dress even though there was nothing to fix. I looked around the room one last time, at the faces I'd grown up with, at the people who had just watched me fall. Then I turned, grabbed my coat from the hook by the door, and walked out into the cold night without saying a word. The door closed behind me, cutting off the music, the laughter, the sound of dinner being served. I stood on the porch for a moment, breathing in the freezing air, my chest tight, my hands numb. Inside, Christmas went on without me. And that was the moment I finally understood my place in that house had never been a seat at the table at all. I sat in my car, with the engine running, the headlights cutting two pale lines across the snow-covered driveway. The house stood there quietly, windows glowing, curtains drawn, as if nothing unusual had happened inside. As if dinner hadn't just continued without me. My hands rested on the steering wheel, stiff and numb. My hip throbbed in slow, deep pulses, and my palms burned where they'd hit the floor. But the physical pain barely registered. It felt distant, secondary, like background noise. What replayed in my head over and over were the sounds. The laughter. Not the kind that erupts when something is genuinely funny. It was scattered, uneven. A few sharp bursts, a couple of nervous chuckles, the kind people make when they don't know what else to do. And then the silence that followed, thick and deliberate, before silverware clinked again, and someone asked to pass the potatoes. That sound hurt more than the fall. I stared at the front door, half expecting it to open, half expecting someone to come running out, calling my name, apologizing, saying it had gone too far. The door never moved. I thought about the faces around the table, replaying them like frozen frames. My uncle, leaning back in his chair, laughing outright like he'd just witnessed a joke that landed better than expected. My aunt, lips pressed into a smile that didn't reach her eyes, the kind of smile you wear when you don't want to be involved. My cousin, staring down at his phone thumb, scrolling, pretending this had nothing to do with him. And Samantha. She never looked at me, not once. She just sat down in the chair that had been taken from me, adjusted her napkin, and picked up her fork, like the moment belonged to her all along. That was when it hit me. No one was surprised. Not a single person around that table had looked shocked. No gasps. No "Richard, that's enough." No instinctive reaction to protect someone who had just been pushed to the floor. This wasn't a mistake. It wasn't a moment that got out of hand. It was permission. Permission they'd already given him silently over years. I thought back to past holidays. Thanksgivings where Richard had made comments about how Samantha was going places while I was still figuring things out. Christmas mornings where gifts for her came wrapped in glossy paper, and mine felt like afterthoughts. Birthday dinners where jokes were made at my expense, followed by, "Relax, we're just teasing." Each moment had felt small on its own. Easy to brush off. Easy to forgive. Together they formed a pattern I'd spent years pretending not to see. I realized something else then, sitting in that car with the heater blasting and my breath fogging the windshield. The fall hadn't humiliated me. The laughter did. Being pushed was an act of cruelty. Being laughed at was an act of agreement. I put the car in drive and pulled away from the house, tires crunching softly against the snow. I didn't know where I was going. I just knew I couldn't stay there another second. The streets blurred past me, familiar roads suddenly feeling foreign. Houses lit up with Christmas decorations lined the blocks. Inflatable snowmen waving wreaths hanging on doors. Families inside those houses were probably arguing about who burned the rolls, or which movie to watch. I wondered how many of them were pretending everything was fine. I drove until the neighborhood thinned out, until the houses gave way to dark storefronts and quiet intersections. Eventually, I pulled into an empty parking lot near a closed grocery store and shut off the engine. The silence rushed in immediately. That was when I started to cry. Not the kind of crying you see in movies. No sobbing, no dramatic gasps for air. Just quiet tears slipping down my face, shoulders shaking just enough to release the pressure building in my chest. I cried for the girl who had spent years trying to be agreeable, helpful, easy to love. I cried for every time I'd told myself I was being too sensitive. And I cried because somewhere deep down I'd known this moment was coming. This wasn't about a chair. It had never been about a chair. It was about being erased, about being tolerated, not chosen, about existing in a family where my presence was conditional. As the tears slowed, something else settled in, a strange calm. For the first time, I stopped asking myself what I could have done differently. I stopped replaying conversations, wondering if I should have spoken up sooner, tried harder, smiled more. I realized I'd been auditioning for a role that was never going to be mine. You can't earn a place at a table where someone has already decided you don't belong. I wiped my face with the sleeve of my coat and took a deep breath. The sting in my eyes faded, replaced by a dull ache that felt more honest than the sharp pain before it. My phone buzzed in the cup holder. I didn't look at it, not yet. I sat there for a few more minutes, letting the cold seep through the car, grounding me. When I finally started the engine again, it wasn't with the intention of going back. I drove toward my apartment, the city lights growing brighter as I got closer. My reflection faint in the windshield. Whatever waited for me next, I knew one thing for certain. I was done trying to belong somewhere I had already been pushed out of. In my mind, I kept circling back to the year everything shifted, even though I hadn't known it at the time. 2014. The year my mother married Richard. My father had been gone less than 2 years then. Cancer moved fast and grief moved slower. The house still smelled like his aftershave some mornings. His coffee mug stayed in the back of the cabinet because none of us could bring ourselves to move it. Back then, my mom was still herself. Lauren Parker was sharp, organized, decisive. She ran charity events like a general runs a campaign. People listened when she spoke. She didn't ask permission. When Richard came into our lives, he didn't arrive like a storm. He arrived like relief. He was charming, in the careful way attentive without being intrusive. He fixed things around the house without being asked. He brought groceries. He talked about stability and partnership. He said things like, "You've been carrying so much on your own, and you deserve someone to take care of you." I watched my mom relax around him in ways I hadn't seen since my dad got sick. At first, decisions were framed as ours. What to do with the business my father left behind, how to handle investments, whether to renovate the kitchen or wait another year. Then slowly, subtly, ours became his. Money conversations disappeared. I remember asking once casually how the company was doing. Richard smiled and said, "It's complicated adult stuff. You don't need to worry about it." My mom laughed it off. Arguments, when they happened, ended the same way every time. "Let's not upset him," or "This isn't the hill to die on," or my least favorite, "He means well." I remember moments when my mom almost defended me. Almost. Like the Thanksgiving when Richard joked about how Samantha was ambitious while I was comfortable. I saw my mom open her mouth, hesitate, then close it again. Or my birthday dinner, when Samantha received loud applause for announcing she'd landed an internship, and my promotion at work was met with polite nods and a quick change of subject. Dinners where Richard corrected me publicly, not harshly, casually. "That's not quite right, Emily." Or, "Let me explain it in a way that makes more sense." Everyone else would smile, relieved that the tension hadn't escalated. I used to tell myself my mom didn't notice. But she did. She always did. I used to think she was weak, that she was choosing comfort over courage, that she was failing me on purpose. It took years and a lot of uncomfortable honesty with myself to understand the truth. She wasn't weak. She was afraid. Afraid of losing stability after barely surviving loss. Afraid of being alone again in a house that still echoed with grief. Afraid of admitting that the man she trusted might not be the man she thought he was. And maybe, most of all, afraid that if she pushed back too hard, everything she'd rebuilt would collapse. Richard never raised his voice at her. He didn't have to. His disappointment was quiet, calculated. A long silence. A subtle withdrawal. The sense that peace depended on compliance. She learned quickly what made life easier. So did I. Christmas Eve wasn't the first time she stayed silent while he crossed a line. It was just the first time the silence was so loud, it couldn't be ignored. Standing there in that dining room, watching her hands clench at her sides, I finally saw the pattern clearly. Years of swallowed words, of swallowed. Years of choosing quiet over conflict. I didn't feel anger toward her. Not yet. What I felt was disappointment, heavy and dull, pressing against my chest. Disappointment in the space between who she used to be and who she'd become. Disappointment in myself for mistaking endurance for strength. I thought back to the nights I'd sat across from her at the kitchen table telling her about work, about small frustrations, about moments that hurt more than I admitted. She'd listen, nod, offer sympathy, but never challenge the system that caused them. She'd say, "I know it's hard," and then change the subject. After I left the Christmas dinner, she texted me once, "Are you okay?" I stared at the message for a long time. I didn't reply, because the truth was, I didn't know how to explain that being okay would require more than comfort. It would require courage she hadn't shown yet. I parked outside my apartment and sat there, engine off the building, quiet and dark. The snow had started falling again, light and steady, covering everything evenly, as if trying to make it all look untouched. I realized something else in that moment. My mother's silence had taught me how to survive in that house, but it had also taught Richard that no one would stop him. And Christmas Eve wasn't the beginning of that lesson. It was just the day it finally reached me. I grabbed my bag from the passenger seat and stepped out into the cold, my breath visible in the air. As I walked toward the building, my phone buzzed in my hand. This time, I looked at it. A missed call. Not from my mother, from a number I recognized even before I checked the name. It belonged to the company my father had built. I answered the call without saying hello. Emily. The voice on the other end was hesitant, professional. "This is Kevin Brooks. I'm calling from Hale Freight Solutions." Hearing the company name out loud did something strange to me. It pulled me out of my head and dropped me somewhere colder, more precise. Family hurt, but facts were steadier. Facts didn't shift depending on who was in the room. "Yes," I said. "What's going on?" There was a pause. Papers rustled. I was hoping to speak to Richard, but I saw your name still listed on some of the legacy documents. I thought you should know there were some irregularities flagged today. Nothing formal yet, just enough to make me uncomfortable. Uncomfortable. That was Kevin's word for trouble. "I'll call you back," I said already, reaching for my keys again. After I hung up, I sat there in the car for a moment, staring at my apartment building without really seeing it. Then I put the car in drive. Hale Freight Solutions had been my father's life's work. He started it in 2002 with one leased truck and a second-hand desk squeezed into a rented warehouse on the south side of Chicago. I remembered being a kid sitting on a stack of pallets, while he finished paperwork, listening to him explain routes and deadlines like they were stories worth telling. After he died, my mom trusted Richard to help manage things. It made sense at the time. Richard talked confidently about logistics, about growth, about protecting what my father had built. He said all the right things. Help turned into oversight. Oversight turned into authority. Authority turned into control. I'd noticed things long before Christmas Eve. I just hadn't wanted to name them. As a compliance manager, patterns jump out at me whether I'm looking for them or not. Numbers don't lie, but they do repeat, and repetition is where the truth hides. Over the past year, I'd caught glimpses of financial statements I wasn't meant to see. Loan payments that didn't match any expansion plans. Assets moving between accounts without documentation that made sense. Vendors complaining quietly about late payments while Richard showed up to family events in a new car. Once over dinner, I asked casually, "How's the company doing?" Richard didn't even look up from his plate. "Busy," he said. You wouldn't understand how business works at that level. The way he said it wasn't angry. It was dismissive, like the conversation wasn't worth finishing. That was the moment I realized he assumed I wouldn't look deeper, that my silence had taught him I wouldn't. I parked near the lake and sat there watching the water move slowly under a gray sky. Then I did something I should have done years ago. I called my grandmother. Margaret answered on the second ring. "Emily, Grandma." I said, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me." She didn't respond right away. I heard her breathing on the other end, measured and calm. "I was wondering when you'd notice," she said finally. The words sent a chill through me. "What do you mean?" I asked. She sighed. "Your father was careful. He didn't trust easily, especially after he got sick." She told me about documents he'd put aside. Originals. Copies. Things he didn't want altered or misplaced. She told me about a safety deposit box at a bank in Oak Park, opened years ago, her name listed as a secondary contact. He said if anything ever felt off, you'd know, she said. And you'd know what to do. I gripped the phone tighter. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" "Because he asked me not to," she said gently, "and because I hoped you'd never need to know." We sat in silence for a moment, the weight of that hope settling between us. "I think I need to see those documents," I said. "I think you do too," she replied. "I'll go with you if you want." After we hung up, I didn't feel angry. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt clear. The guessing was over. The second guessing, the self-doubt, the wondering if I was imagining things. All of it fell away. Whatever was happening inside that company wasn't a misunderstanding. It was something my father had anticipated. I went upstairs to my apartment and pulled out my laptop. I opened a new folder and started listing everything I knew. Dates, names, transactions I remembered questioning. Small details that hadn't mattered until now. Outside, the snow kept falling soft and steady, covering the city in a clean, white layer that made everything look simpler than it was. By the time I closed the laptop, the sun had dipped below the buildings, and my phone buzzed again. This time, I didn't need to look at the screen to know who it was. I let it ring. Then I stood up, grabbed my coat, and wrote down the address of the bank in Oak Park. I wasn't guessing anymore. I was about to find out exactly what my father had been trying to protect. I didn't turn on the overhead lights when I got back to my apartment. The city glow coming through the windows was enough pale and bluish reflecting off the snow outside. Everything felt quieter that way, more honest. I dropped my coat over the back of a chair and stood in the middle of the living room staring at the closet door across from me. Inside it on the top shelf was a box I hadn't touched in years. I told myself I was just going to look, just enough to confirm what my grandmother had said. The box was heavier than I remembered, cardboard worn soft at the corners. My father's handwriting faded but still recognizable on the side. His name, a date, nothing dramatic, just organized, typical of him. I sat on the floor and opened it. The smell hit me first. Old paper, dust, a trace of his cologne clinging stubbornly to the past. I closed my eyes for a second, steadying myself, then forced them open again. Inside were folders neatly labeled, bank statements, legal correspondence, printed emails carefully clipped together. This wasn't a memory box. This was preparation. I flipped through slowly, my pulse picking up with each page. He hadn't just saved things. He'd curated them. Then I saw it, a copy of a trust agreement. I pulled it out and spread it on the floor in front of me, my breath shallow as I scanned the pages. Irrevocable. Those words jumped out immediately. Clear language, specific clauses, conditions spelled out with precision that left no room for interpretation. My father hadn't left things to chance. There were provisions for management, restrictions on asset transfers, safeguards against unauthorized control, a section outlining exactly what would happen if someone attempted to consolidate power outside the trust's terms. It was all there. He'd planned for interference. He'd planned for manipulation. He'd planned for someone like Richard. And somehow, impossibly, he'd planned for me. I felt a chill move through me, starting at the base of my spine and spreading outward. Not fear. Something sharper. Cleaner. Clarity. The fall at the dinner table replayed in my mind. But this time, it looked different. Not random. Not impulsive. It was confirmation. Richard hadn't pushed me because he was angry. He'd pushed me because he thought he'd won. Because he believed the years of silence had trained me to accept whatever space he allowed me to occupy. I realized then that I hadn't lost anything that night. I'd been released. I sat there for a long time, the papers spread around me like a map I was just learning to read. At some point, I noticed my cheeks were wet, tears still coming, but slower now, quieter. I let them fall for a few minutes longer, then they stopped. Not because I told myself to be strong, not because I was finished hurting. They stopped because there was work to do. I grabbed my laptop and set it on the coffee table, pushing aside old magazines and a half-empty mug. I opened a new document and titled it simply, Timeline. Dates came first. My father's diagnosis, his death, my mother's remarriage, the point when Richard officially took over operational control of Hale Freight Solutions, then accounts, bank names, loan numbers I recognized from casual mentions over the years, a note I'd once overheard about refinancing, a comment about moving things around temporarily. I added names, Kevin Brooks, vendors who'd quietly complained, the attorney my father had used before he got sick. I didn't feel powerful. I felt prepared. There was a difference. Power was loud, showy, the kind of thing Richard thrived on. Preparation was quiet, patient. It waited for the right moment. My phone buzzed on the table, startling me. I glanced at the screen. Richard. I let it ring. Then again. And again. I turned the phone face down and kept typing. Every so often I paused to cross-reference something in the box. An email here. A letter there. The trust wasn't just protection. It was a blueprint. I remembered my father sitting at the kitchen table years ago, explaining budgets to me like it mattered, like I mattered. He used to say if you understand how the pieces fit together, no one can convince you you're imagining things. I hadn't understood then how much he meant that. Outside, the city moved on. A siren wailed in the distance. A car honked. Somewhere people were finishing Christmas dinner, clearing plates, pouring drinks. Inside my apartment, something had shifted. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't even sad in the way I had been earlier. I was focused. When I finally closed the laptop, it was past midnight. The floor around me was still covered in papers, but they didn't feel overwhelming. They felt like answers. I stacked the documents neatly, placed them back in the box, and slid it under the coffee table where I could reach it easily. I washed my face in the bathroom, the cold water grounding me, then caught my reflection in the mirror. My eyes were red, my hair a mess, but there was something else there too. Resolve. I went back into the living room and picked up my phone. 23 missed calls now. I didn't listen to the voicemails. Not yet. I set an alarm for early morning and crawled into bed, fully clothed, exhaustion settling over me like a heavy blanket. As I stared at the ceiling, one thought repeated itself, steady and calm. This was no longer about what Richard had taken from me. It was about what my father had left me. And tomorrow I would start using it. Morning light crept through the thin gap in my curtains, pale and quiet, like it was testing the room before fully committing. I hadn't slept much. My body had shut down from exhaustion, but my mind never really let go. Thoughts drifted in and out, half-formed, looping back to the same images again and again. The phone on my kitchen counter vibrated before my alarm went off. Once. Then again. Then it didn't stop. I lay there for a moment, staring at the ceiling, listening to the buzz travel through the small apartment like an insect trapped under glass. I didn't reach for it. I already knew what I'd see. When I finally sat up, the vibration had stopped, replaced by silence, so sudden it felt deliberate. I padded into the kitchen, the cold tile biting at my bare feet, and poured myself a glass of water. My phone lit up again as I set the glass down. I turned it face down. The city outside was waking up. I could hear a bus hiss to a stop on the corner, the distant hum of traffic starting to build. It was the day after Christmas. A work day for some, a recovery day for others. For me, it felt like the beginning of something I couldn't quite name yet. I checked the time on the microwave. 6:42. The phone vibrated again. I ignored it and started the coffee maker, measuring the grounds carefully, my hands steady. The normal routine felt grounding, familiar, like muscle memory taking over while my mind stayed quiet. When the coffee finished brewing, I poured a mug and finally flipped the phone over. Missed calls. A lot of them. Text messages stacked on top of each other, most from numbers I recognized immediately. Some I didn't. I didn't open any of them. I scrolled straight to voicemail. The first message was from Kevin Brooks. "Emily, it's Kevin. Call me when you get this. The bank flagged some activity overnight. A couple of accounts are frozen pending review. This isn't something we can smooth over. We need to talk." I replayed it once, then deleted it from the screen without deleting the message itself. Kevin didn't sound panicked. He sounded careful, which meant things were already moving. Another voicemail came in as I stood there. "Richard." I let it play. "What did you do?" His voice was sharp, clipped, stripped of any pretense. "You had no right. Call me back immediately." I didn't flinch. I didn't feel the spike of fear or guilt I would have felt months ago. Instead, I felt something closer to distance, like I was listening to a recording instead of a real person. 10 minutes later, the phone rang again. Same number. I watched it until it stopped. A new voicemail replaced the last one. "Emily," he said, slower this time. Controlled. "We need to talk. There's been a misunderstanding." I smiled just slightly at that word. Misunderstanding. I took my coffee to the small table by the window and sat down. Outside, the sky had brightened, the snow reflecting light back into the city. Everything looked clean. Reset. The phone buzzed again. I checked the call log. The number was climbing steadily. I didn't answer. For years, my instinct had been to respond immediately, to explain, to smooth things over, to make sure no one was upset, especially him. This time, I stayed still. Another voicemail arrived, this one from a number I didn't recognize. Ms. Parker, this is Daniel Hargreave from First Midwest Trust. We need to verify some information regarding Hail Freight Solutions. Please return my call as soon as possible. I set the phone down and wrapped both hands around my mug, letting the warmth sink into my fingers. Richard called again. I imagined him pacing the living room of that house in Evanston, phone pressed to his ear, jaw tight. I imagined the way his confidence would be cracking now, not loudly, not yet, but enough for him to feel it. I didn't feel the urge to confront him. I didn't feel the urge to explain myself. For the first time in years, I wasn't reacting. I was waiting. The calls kept coming. Some numbers rang once and stopped. Others tried repeatedly. A few left messages that I didn't listen to. I didn't need to. The pattern was clear enough. By 8:30, the missed call count had crossed into the 20s. I showered, letting hot water run over my sore hip, grounding me in my body again. The bruise was already forming deep and dark. I pressed my fingers against it and exhaled slowly. Pain anchored me in the present. When I got dressed, I chose comfortable clothes, not the professional armor I usually wore. I wasn't going into an office. I wasn't performing today. I checked my email for the first time. 3 new messages from the bank. 1 from a legal firm whose name I recognized from my father's files. 2 calendar invites from Kevin. Both marked urgent. I didn't respond to any of them yet. Instead, I opened my laptop and reviewed the document I'd created the night before. The timeline, the names, the notes I'd added while the city slept. Everything I needed was already there. The phone rang again. This time it was my mother. I stared at her name on the screen longer than I had at any of the others. The call went to voicemail. She didn't leave a message. I closed the laptop and leaned back in my chair, listening to the quiet of my apartment. It felt different now. Charged. Like the air before a storm, but without the panic. My phone buzzed once more. I glanced at the screen. 32 missed calls. I set the phone down gently face up this time and took a slow sip of coffee. For years, my life had been about managing reactions, anticipating moods, adjusting myself to fit whatever version of reality kept the peace. This morning, the peace was gone, and for the first time, I wasn't trying to bring it back. I looked out the window as a plow moved down the street, scraping away what had settled overnight. Beneath the snow, the pavement was still there, solid and unchanged. I stayed where I was, letting the phone ring itself into silence, knowing that whatever came next would come whether I rushed toward it or not. And this time I was ready to let it arrive. The phone finally went quiet on its own. I didn't notice right away. I was rinsing my mug at the sink, watching the coffee swirl down the drain, when the silence settled in. No vibration, no ringing. Just the low hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of traffic outside. I picked up my phone and looked at the screen. 57 missed calls. The number sat there static like it had decided it was done climbing. I didn't feel relief. I didn't feel triumph. What I felt was something closer to attention, like my mind had shifted into a different mode. Observation. I scrolled through the call log slowly, not rushing, letting each name and number register. The first cluster was obvious. Richard. Call after call after call stacked on top of each other. The early ones were aggressive, short, demanding, voicemails that didn't bother hiding their tone. Call me back. Now. You don't get to do this. You're making a huge mistake. Later calls sounded different, still controlled but thinner around the edges. His words chosen more carefully, like he was trying to remember how persuasion worked. We can fix this. There's no need to involve anyone else. Then there were the unfamiliar numbers. I clicked into one voicemail and listened. Ms. Parker. This is Alan Whitmore, with Whitmore & Cole. We represent several parties associated with Hail Freight Solutions. Please return our call regarding outstanding obligations. Outstanding obligations? I didn't need to hear the rest. Another voicemail followed from a different number. Emily. This is Mark Sullivan. We've worked together before. Richard suggested I reach out. We just need some clarity on a few financial matters. Business partners. People who didn't call unless something had gone wrong. I scrolled further. 1 missed call from my mother. Just 1. No voicemail. That hurt more than I expected, but it didn't derail me. It simply confirmed what I already knew. She didn't know what to say yet, Or she didn't feel ready to say it. Then my phone buzzed again, this time with a text. Kevin Brooks, IRS inquiry just came in. This is serious. I read it twice. Then I set the phone down and leaned against the counter, closing my eyes. Each call represented something different breaking apart. Money, control, image. Richard had always believed those three things were enough to keep him untouchable. He'd built his life around them, confident that as long as they held, nothing else mattered. What he hadn't accounted for was gravity. I carried my phone back to the table and sat down, opening my laptop. The document from the night before was still open, waiting exactly where I'd left it. I read through everything again, not because I doubted it, but because I wanted to be sure. Dates matched, names aligned, numbers told the same story no matter how I looked at them. There was no dramatic music, no sense of finality, just confirmation. I opened a new email window and addressed it to the bank's compliance department. I attached the packet I'd assembled: trust documents, transaction summaries, notes outlining discrepancies. Everything was factual, clean, precise. I didn't add commentary, no explanation, no accusations, just facts. Then I opened another email. IRS, same attachments, same approach. I sat back in my chair after I hit send, my heart steady, my breathing even. I didn't feel like I was destroying anything. I felt like I was stepping aside and letting weight fall where it naturally would. My phone buzzed again, but I didn't pick it up. I didn't need to see the screen to know it wasn't anything new. For years I'd been told I was too sensitive, too cautious, too careful. What no one had ever realized was that careful didn't mean weak. It meant thorough. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out over the street below. The snow had been cleared in uneven lines, dirty slush pushed to the sides. People moved around it without thinking, adjusting their steps instinctively. That was how systems worked too. You didn't fight gravity. You accounted for it. Another voicemail came in. This one was from a woman, Emily. Parker. This is Sandra Lowe from First Midwest Trust. We're reaching out regarding an account review tied to Hail Freight Solutions. Please call us at your earliest convenience. I almost laughed at the phrase. Earliest convenience. Richard had spent years assuming convenience belonged to him. I turned away from the window and glanced at my phone one more time. 57 missed calls. The number felt final, not because it couldn't change, but because it represented a shift. Before this morning, I had been reacting to a life shaped by someone else's decisions. Now things were moving without me pushing. That was the difference. I shut my laptop and slid it into my bag, not because I was going anywhere yet, but because I wanted to be ready. I straightened the papers on the table, stacking them neatly, returning order to the room. My phone buzzed again. This time I picked it up and silenced it completely. Not to avoid what was coming, just to choose when I would engage. I sat back down, resting my hands on the table, feeling the solid wood beneath my palms. For the first time since Christmas Eve, my body felt fully present, grounded in the moment, instead of bracing for the next blow. Whatever Richard thought this was turning into, so it wasn't a fight. It was an accounting, and the numbers had finally caught up. The first time I saw the video, it wasn't sent to me directly. It showed up in a neighborhood Facebook group I wasn't even active in anymore. Evanston Community Watch. Someone had tagged a friend who tagged another friend, and eventually the clip found its way onto my screen, like a message that didn't care whether I was ready to receive it. The angle was bad, shaky, shot from across the room, half blocked by someone's shoulder. But the moment was unmistakable. Me standing by the table. Richard rising from his chair. The sudden movement, my body disappearing out of frame as I hit the floor. The caption was short. Did anyone else see this? That was all it took. The comments multiplied faster than I could read them. Some people rushed to Richard's defense. Family business. We don't know the whole story. She probably said something first. Videos don't show everything. Others were horrified. That man just pushed her. Why is no one helping her up? That's abuse. Plain and simple. A few comments stuck with me longer than the rest. Why is everyone laughing? Where's her mother? I scrolled until my thumb went numb, then locked my phone and set it face down on the counter. The silence that followed felt heavier than before, like the story had officially stepped out of the house and into the world. Once something leaves the family, you don't get to control how it's handled anymore. At work, the shift was immediate. An email from HR landed in my inbox before noon's subject line, neutral to the point of discomfort. Request for meeting, mandatory attendance. I joined the call from my apartment laptop balanced on the table, coffee long gone cold. Ellen Moore appeared on the screen, hands folded neatly, expression calm but distant. "Emily," she said, "thank you for meeting with us on such short notice." I nodded. "This is standard procedure," she continued, careful with every word. "Given the circumstances and the public attention surrounding the situation, we're placing you on temporary administrative leave, effective immediately." I didn't argue. I'd expected this. "It's not disciplinary," she added, "just precautionary. We need to ensure there's no conflict of interest while things are being reviewed." "I understand," I said, and I did. The call ended quickly. No sympathy. No judgment. Just process. When I closed the laptop, the apartment felt quieter than usual. Not lonely, just exposed. Like the walls had thinned overnight. The change followed me everywhere. In the hallway of my building, a neighbor who usually smiled at me pressed her lips together and looked away. Another slowed down just enough to stare before pretending to check his phone. At the grocery store, I heard my name whispered behind me in the produce aisle. I didn't turn around. At checkout, the cashier hesitated for half a second too long before asking if I wanted paper or plastic. None of it was aggressive. None of it was kind. It was attention without context, curiosity without care. For years, I'd gone out of my way to stay invisible, to blend in, to avoid standing out in any way that might invite scrutiny. I'd told myself it was maturity, professionalism. Now I saw it for what it had been. Fear. Fear of being talked about, fear of being misunderstood, fear of being the problem. That fear had never protected me. It had only kept me quiet. Back at home, I checked the Facebook group again, not because I wanted to, but because I needed to see how fast things were moving. The video had been shared dozens of times. Someone had reposted it to a local news page. Another person had started a thread asking if charges could be filed. Richard's name appeared more frequently now. Some spelled it wrong. Some added titles he'd always loved. Business owner, community member. Someone commented, "I've worked with him. Never had an issue." Someone else replied, "That doesn't mean he's not capable of this." I noticed something else too. People were arguing with each other. About responsibility. About intent. About whether it was my place to speak out or stay quiet. And for once, I wasn't part of the argument. I didn't comment. I didn't correct misinformation. I didn't explain myself. I stayed still. That night, my phone buzzed with notifications I didn't open. Messages from acquaintances I barely remembered. A couple from family members I hadn't heard from in years. I ignored them all. I made dinner for myself, something simple, and ate it standing at the counter. Outside, the city moved as it always did. Traffic lights changed. People walked their dogs. Life continued with or without my participation. I realized then that attention wasn't the enemy I'd always thought it was. Silence had been. Silence had allowed things to grow unchecked. It had given Richard room to believe he was untouchable. It had taught everyone else that looking away was easier than intervening. I wasn't breaking that silence with words. I was breaking it by not hiding anymore. Later, as I lay in bed, the glow from my phone lighting up the ceiling, every time a notification came through, I felt exposed in a way I never had before. Not ashamed, not embarrassed, just seen. I turned the phone off completely and set it on the nightstand. Tomorrow would bring more noise, more opinions, more consequences. Tonight, I let the world argue without me. I closed my eyes, breathing slowly, knowing that once a story leaves the house, it doesn't belong to anyone anymore. And for the first time, I didn't feel the need to take it back. Rachel Nguyen's office sat on the 4th floor of a brick building near downtown Chicago, the kind of place that didn't try to look impressive. No glass walls, no dramatic views, just quiet, neutral space designed for people who needed clarity, not comfort. She shook my hand once and gestured for me to sit. "Start wherever you want," she said. So I did. I told her about the company, about my father, about the trust documents, about Christmas Eve. I didn't embellish. I didn't soften anything. I laid it out the same way I'd learned to handle compliance reports at work. Facts, first, emotions only where they mattered. Rachel listened without interrupting. She didn't nod excessively. She didn't frown or widen her eyes at the worst parts. She just listened occasionally, making a note on a yellow legal pad. When I finished, she leaned back slightly in her chair and folded her hands. You did the right thing by documenting everything she said. That was it. No dramatic reassurance, no talk about justice or karma, just acknowledgement. She explained the process carefully, what the bank would need, what the IRS would do next, what timelines typically looked like. The law moves slowly, she said, meeting my eyes. But it does move. I nodded. I wasn't looking for speed. I was looking for inevitability. Over the next few days, the formal notices started arriving. Certified letters, secure emails, requests worded with professional distance. The IRS wanted clarification on several years of filings connected to Hale Freight Solutions. The bank requested additional documentation related to asset transfers and loan guarantees. Each request came with deadlines. Each deadline came with consequences. Richard hired a public relations attorney named Thomas Reed. I recognized the name from his website before I ever saw it attached to an article. The headline appeared on a regional news site late one afternoon. Local businessman. Accused by stepdaughter. I read it once, then closed the browser. The framing annoyed me, but not enough to react. Accused implied emotion. What was happening now didn't run on emotion. Richard called again that evening. You're ruining this family, he said, his voice tight with something that sounded like desperation. Do you have any idea what you're doing? I listened until he stopped talking, then ended the call without saying a word. Kevin Brooks emailed me from his personal account the next morning. I can't be part of this anymore. Attached were files I hadn't even known existed. Internal ledgers, emails between Richard and vendors, records of loans routed through shell accounts I recognized from my father's notes. Proof, clean, organized, damning. As I saved the files to my laptop, something shifted in me. The case stopped being personal. It wasn't about a stepfather who'd pushed me to the floor or a family that had laughed instead of helping me up. It wasn't even about betrayal anymore. It was procedural. Numbers, paper trails, compliance failures. And that's when I knew it was real. Because systems don't care who you are. They don't get distracted by charm or reputation. They just follow the weight of evidence wherever it leads. I closed my laptop and leaned back in my chair, the room quiet around me. Outside, traffic moved steadily, unaware of how many lives were changing behind closed doors. The law was slow, but it was moving, and it wasn't stopping for anyone. The messages started coming in quietly one by one, usually late at night or early in the morning when people felt safest, saying things they'd held back for years. They didn't comment publicly. They didn't defend me online. They reached out in private, like confessions whispered behind closed doors. I didn't know what to do. One text read. Another said, "He scared me. I didn't think it was my place." A cousin I hadn't spoken to in years sent a long message that started with, "I should have helped you up," and ended with, "I'm sorry I froze." I read every one of them. I didn't respond right away. Not because I was angry, but because I was trying to understand what they were really saying. They weren't apologizing for what they'd done. They were explaining why they hadn't acted, and in a strange way that mattered. It didn't excuse anything, but it clarified the shape of the silence I'd lived inside for so long. Silence wasn't always indifference. Sometimes it was fear wearing a polite smile. A few days later, my mom came to see me. She didn't call first. She just showed up at my apartment building in the early afternoon, her car parked crookedly along the curb, like she hadn't taken the time to straighten it. I saw her through the window before she buzzed. She looked smaller than I remembered. Not physically exactly, just less solid, like something essential had been removed. When I opened the door, she didn't step forward right away. "Can I come in?" she asked. I nodded and stepped aside. We sat at my kitchen table, the same one where I'd spread out documents nights earlier, where I'd made coffee and waited while my phone rang itself into exhaustion. I poured her a glass of water. She wrapped both hands around it, but didn't drink. She didn't cry. That surprised me. She didn't apologize immediately either. She just looked at the table at the small scratch near the edge where I'd once dropped a plate. "I should have protected you," she said. The words landed softly. No drama, no qualifiers. She didn't say she was confused. She didn't say she didn't know. She didn't mention Richard at all. I told myself I was keeping the peace, she continued, but I was really just avoiding the truth. I waited. Let her speak at her own pace. I was afraid, she said. Afraid of starting over. Afraid of being wrong. Afraid of losing the version of my life I thought I'd rebuilt. She finally looked up at me then, and I let that fear make me quiet when you needed me to be loud. No excuses, no explanations meant to soften the impact. Just the truth. It didn't fix everything. The years didn't rewind themselves. The memories didn't disappear. But something shifted. The pain changed shape. It wasn't a sharp, constant ache anymore. It became something heavier, but more contained, something I could hold without it cutting into me. We sat there for a while without speaking. Outside, a delivery truck idled, then pulled away. Somewhere down the block, a dog barked. I don't expect forgiveness, she said finally. I just didn't want you to think I didn't see it now. I know, I said. And I did. I walked her to the door when she left. She hesitated on the threshold, then reached out and squeezed my hand once. It wasn't a grand gesture. It was careful, respectful. After she was gone, I went back to the table and sat down again. More messages came in over the next few days. From an aunt who admitted she'd always felt uncomfortable around Richard but never knew how to say it. From a former employee of the company who said they'd left because something felt off. Each message carried the same underlying theme. People speak when they feel safe. Some only find their voices once the power dynamic shifts, once the person who scared them loses their grip. It was a sobering realization. I thought about Christmas Eve again, about how many people had been in that room, how many eyes had watched me fall, how many of them had chosen stillness instead of action. For years I'd internalized that silence as a verdict on my worth. Now I saw it differently. It was a measure of their fear. That didn't make it okay, but it made it make sense. That night I sat alone in my apartment light's dim phone resting untouched on the table. The city outside felt quieter than usual, like it was holding its breath. I didn't feel victorious. I didn't feel redeemed. I felt steady. People were finally speaking, but not because they'd suddenly become brave. They were speaking because the risk had changed. And I understood something else, too. Not everyone who stays silent is your enemy. But silence always serves someone. For years it hadn't served me. Now, at last, it wasn't the loudest thing in the room anymore. I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes, letting the quiet settle, knowing the next phase wouldn't be emotional or loud or personal. It would be decisive, and it was already in motion. Things didn't explode the way movies make you expect them to. They tightened. One morning I woke up to an email from Rachel with the subject line "Asset Freeze Confirmation." Short, clinical. Attached documents stamped in dated language so precise it felt almost gentle in its finality. Accounts associated with Hale Freight Solutions were frozen pending investigation. Real estate holdings flagged, credit lines suspended, no sirens, no confrontation, just doors quietly locking. Charges followed in the same way. Filed, not announced. Paperwork moving through channels most people never think about unless they're suddenly inside them. Richard's name started appearing again. But this time, not in community newsletters or business spotlights. It showed up in legal briefs, in court calendars, in articles that used phrases like alleged misconduct and ongoing investigation. A different kind of headline. I didn't read all of them. I didn't need to. The tone was enough. Samantha pivoted quickly. She always had been good at that. Her social media shifted overnight. Photos of her and Richard disappeared. Old captions vanished. New posts appeared instead, all soft colors and vague language. Choosing peace, protecting my energy, stepping back from negativity. People praised her for it. Commented heart emojis and words like strong and wise. I didn't comment. I didn't unfollow either. I just watched the same way I'd watched so many other things unfold without my input. Except this time, it didn't feel like powerlessness. It felt like choice. I attended one meeting in person, Rachel insisted. Not because it was dramatic, but because presence mattered. The conference room was nondescript. Neutral walls, long table, water pitchers no one touched. People introduced themselves by name and role, not reputation. No one mentioned Christmas Eve. No one mentioned family. I sat there not as a victim, not as a daughter or stepdaughter, but as the legal beneficiary of my father's trust. That distinction mattered more than I'd expected. When questions were directed at me, they were precise, focused, respectful. I answered them calmly, provided documents when asked, clarified timelines. No one looked at me with pity. No one looked at me like I was fragile. No one applauded. And that felt right. Justice didn't feel like vindication. It felt like alignment. Like the system was finally oriented the way it should have been all along. When the meeting ended, Rachel gathered her papers and nodded at me once. "This is moving the way it should," she said quietly. Outside, the city felt the same as ever. Cars passed. People hurried by, unaware of the internal shifts happening behind office doors and legal language. Richard tried calling again once late at night. I didn't answer. He didn't leave a voicemail. That silence was louder than any apology he could have offered. In the days that followed, I noticed how my body responded to things differently. My shoulders didn't tense when my phone buzzed. My stomach didn't drop when an unfamiliar number appeared. I slept better. The bruise on my hip faded from deep purple to yellow, then disappeared entirely. The memory of it remained, but it no longer lived in my body. It had moved somewhere else, somewhere quieter. I thought about karma, then the way people talk about it like thunder. Loud, public, punitive. This wasn't that. This was precise. It didn't shout. It didn't humiliate. It didn't need witnesses. It simply corrected an imbalance that had gone on too long. Richard had built his sense of safety on control on the assumption that no one would challenge him, because doing so would be uncomfortable, disruptive, impolite. He'd been right for a long time. Until he wasn't. I walked along the lake one afternoon, the air cold but clear, the water moving steadily against the shore. People passed me in both directions, bundled up, focused on their own lives. No one recognized me. No one stared. And for the first time in weeks, that felt like peace, not erasure. I checked my phone and saw another article had been posted. I didn't open it. I slipped the phone back into my pocket and kept walking. Justice didn't need my attention to continue doing its work. It was already there, waiting patiently, arriving exactly when it was supposed to. Sometimes, late at night, when the apartment is quiet and the city outside my window finally slows down, my mind drifts back to that hardwood floor. Not the whole scene, just fragments. The cold shock when my body hit it, the way the air left my lungs all at once, the strange clarity of the ceiling above me, and then the sound, the laughter, not loud enough to feel cruel on its own, but scattered, careless, just enough to tell me everything I needed to know. That sound stayed with me longer than the bruise ever did. For a long time I told myself that moment was about humiliation, about being embarrassed in front of people who were supposed to be family, about losing my place at a table I'd worked too hard to keep. I was wrong. That moment wasn't about a chair, or a dinner, or even Richard. It was about silence. The silence that followed the laughter. The silence that came from people who looked away. The silence my mother had practiced for years because she thought it was safer than confrontation. That silence taught me something I'd been avoiding my entire adult life. Silence doesn't keep the peace. It just keeps the truth waiting. For years I thought strength meant enduring, staying calm, not rocking the boat. I thought if I could just be reasonable enough, agreeable enough, things would eventually balance out on their own. They don't. Balance doesn't appear because you're patient. It appears when the truth is allowed to exist in the open. I didn't win by pushing back. I didn't win by yelling, exposing anyone publicly, or demanding apologies that would have rung hollow anyway. I won by standing still long enough to see clearly, by paying attention when my instincts whispered instead of screamed, by trusting the quiet discomfort that told me something wasn't right even when everyone else insisted it was fine. There's a moment I think about often now. Not the fall itself, but what happened right after. How I stood up on my own. No one helped me. No one reached out a hand. But I stood anyway. At the time it felt lonely. Now it feels like the first honest thing I did for myself. The aftermath didn't give me satisfaction the way people imagine justice should. There was no dramatic confrontation where Richard admitted fault. No tearful speech where everything suddenly made sense. What there was instead was alignment. Systems doing what they were designed to do when given the truth. People speaking only after they felt safe enough to do so. My mother finding her voice not in defense but in honesty. And me learning that my worth was never something that needed approval. I still think about the family dinners that came before that night. The way I measured my words. The way I adjusted myself to fit the room. The way I ignored the quiet voice telling me I was shrinking. I don't do that anymore. Not because I'm braver now, but because I'm clearer. If you're listening to this, and something about it feels familiar, I want you to hear this part carefully. You're not imagining it. That uneasy feeling you get when someone crosses a line and everyone pretends they didn't see it. The way your body reacts before your mind catches up. The exhaustion that comes from always being the one who adapts. That's not weakness. That's awareness. Sometimes the moment that breaks you isn't the end of your story. It's the point where the truth finally stops waiting for permission. I didn't lose a family that night. I lost an illusion. And in its place, I gained something far more solid: clarity, boundaries, and the understanding that silence is only neutral if it isn't protecting harm. I still walk past hardwood floors every day, in offices, in stores, in other people's homes. They don't haunt me anymore. They remind me. They remind me that standing up doesn't always look like a fight. Sometimes it looks like refusing to lie to yourself anymore. Thank you for listening to my story and staying with me all the way to the end. If this resonated with you, if you've ever found yourself in a room where the silence felt louder than the truth, I'd really like to hear from you. Share your thoughts in the comments, or your own experience if you feel comfortable. And if stories like this matter to you, if you want to hear more real, complicated human moments about boundaries, family, and finding clarity when everything feels upside down, I hope you'll stay here with me. You're not alone. And sometimes that realization is where everything truly begins.